We didn't want to do anything that was noticeably brought in from other mods. We didn't want to essentially have mods that changed the way the world looked, outside of shaders, of course. We essentially used shaders to give the regular Minecraft world more realistic lighting, but outside of that, we didn't want to bring in mods that, say, bring in new creatures or anything else that you wouldn't expect to find in Minecraft. So one of the things that we really didn't expect to have was an original score. Originally, we just planned to use various royalty-free music like we usually do for our videos. I had finished the first few cuts of the first few episodes with those in place. But what ended up happening was I came across this fellow on a forum named Stephan Sykora, and he was looking for some web series or just online work to get his composing abilities out there. And I came across him and I said, hey, we got this big web series that we're working on. How about you give us a score for that and we'll give you a big fat credit and, you know, link your website and everything. And yeah, he agreed to that. And what we thought was going to be the music for the show ended up just becoming a temp track. That temp track eventually got replaced by the score, which was completely amazing to hear happen because I'd never worked with a composer before making an original score.
It's about time. Y'all better move your blocky butts.
Move, double time.
It's about time. Y'all better move your blocky butts.
Move, double time.
Once the cuts were locked and all the audio was in its place and all the temp tracks were in their place, then I would send that over to Stephan Sykora, and then he would eventually send back the finished score, and we would just replace the temp music with that in the finished mix. And then I would send all of that over to our sound editor Sayres, who would put in the Foley and balance the voiceovers and add effects and all that kind of stuff, and lots of ambient sounds that really made it pop and kind of come to life a little bit in the sound department. So that was our long pipeline for post-production. And I would also send a few shots here and there over to Lauren, who would be doing some basic compositing here and there, and also compositing the title shots that we included in each episode.
You have the title in the shot, which was my first experience in rotoscoping, with the title on the ground and then Vera walking over it. Well, so how the title started was, I think Raph was working on episode 4, and he found like this perfect spot to just place the title of the episode in. It was like, this is really good. It would be really odd if this was just in episode 4. Looked back at the first 3 episodes, we found some nice places to put the titles in, but it was like a week out into launching the first episode. So he's like handing me the first part of the first episode, says, put the title here, and it's gonna be rotoscoped. So then I had to go and look at it and be like, okay, yeah, I can do that. And just sat down for a couple days and just knocked that out.
The first episode was an interesting challenge. One of the biggest shots in the first episode was one that actually had to be redone a couple of times. It's the first shot of the capital city. We have this big, flowing, establishing shot. And the interesting thing about that was, originally the way we were shooting back in these early episodes was with body actors and spectator mode, essentially, and then a camera mod called Pixel Cam. And that was basically the entirety of our production setup. All of the body actors were players that we had to get into the game and get moving around controlling the various characters. And so it made it very difficult to get certain shots like this big establishing shot done because we could only have so many people on screen at the same time. But fast forward a little bit, we come across this mod called Blockbuster, which allows us to create basically controllable player character models without having players to control them. Essentially, you could remote control them and then set them all up in a scene and then have them play out. We did encounter that before the first episode went live, and so this one shot, which took us a good few tries to get right, I ended up just redoing with Blockbuster and then recreating the camera path and then using Blockbuster to get a way better looking version of the shot with way more people and way more activity than the original version. So yeah, and that ended up being the shot that you see in the final product.
it was a very big goal of ours to make sure that the effects that were shown didn't look like they came from outside of Minecraft. So my job was to take the built-in effects and particles and creature spawns and make it so that they happened exactly the way that we wanted them to in that scene. So for example, in the first scene with the Night Ops, it was shooting zombies and skeletons in a field. So you just go in, start placing zombies and skeletons, and they would start to wander around. That was not good. You didn't want them to wander around too much. We started to learn really quickly how hard it was to wrangle random AI mobs. We started doing a lot of tricks like putting them in barrier walls so that they didn't walk around, but they still looked around, or giving them tracks to follow with using literal rail tracks because the creatures didn't go over tracks. So we would put those down. I would go into the texture files and make those textures invisible. You can't see them, but the zombies will still follow that track. There's this one scene where the zombie comes up in camera, looks, and then gets shot with an arrow. If you wanted to do that in just vanilla Minecraft, that would be a lot of stuff that would have to go right exactly as you wanted them. We didn't have that kind of time. This is a production. Basically, what I would do, I would spawn him on one end, have something that he wanted, like a zombie or a villager or something on the other end. He would walk that way. I would be ready with an arrow. Whenever he got to the right spot, I would become visible in survival, and he would look at me, and then I would shoot him. And all of that would happen off camera. But it was a lot of stuff that we were starting to figure out, like roundabout ways to get creatures with random AI to do what we told them to do, basically. Because they're not actors. A lot of villagers died filming this movie. You have to put that at the bottom.
So I guess only the one big action sequence in the first episode is the scene that introduces the Night Ops team, Gamma team. I think it was the first night scene that we shot, and one thing that I completely underestimated was how dark nighttime is with shaders. So we had a couple of different shaders that we planned on using. Thankfully, the Vibrant one that we used, Silder's Vibrant shaders, looks really good at night and does some really interesting effects with the moonlight.
Once the Night Ops get into the cave, first of all, the guy who built that, I wish he stuck around for longer, but he built some really awesome sets. He really set the bar for like interior decorations.
Yeah, that was an interesting scene to shoot. It was definitely a crash course in mob wrangling, as we like to call it. Of course, for scenes like when they encounter the spawner is a little bit more straightforward. We just put the players in survival mode and just spawn some actual monsters with AI and have them go at the players. And the interesting part is that some of the props, I guess you could call them, some of the weapons and items that the players were using had some enchantments that were specifically designed to their characters. So most of the characters with swords would have very powerful swords that would just kill a mob in one hit. That way it makes a visible difference whenever they hit one of their enemies. But then on the other hand, Eric, who is meant to be the big brute of the group, had a sword with more knockback than you can naturally get on a sword in vanilla Minecraft. So he wouldn't be killing the mobs in one hit, but every time he hit them, they would just go flying across. And it just made the action sequences a lot more dynamic and a lot more characterized in a way.
Mob spawners typically would just start spawning creatures. That's not good, because we need it to be able to look at it, get a good look, then it starts spawning creatures when we want them to spawn creatures. There was a fake wall behind it in the cave. There was a fake wall that I would just go into, set up some commands. Generally speaking, throughout all of production, mob spawning was off, so creatures couldn't spawn unless I told them to. So I would be behind the fake wall and start pressing buttons every time that we needed a bunch of zombies to spawn. Raph would be the camera in the scene saying, like, action on zombies, press the zombie buttons, zombies would spawn, also make them in survival mode so they can fight. And then once the scene was done, put them back into creative, send them on their way.
Yeah, and one of the things that became very apparent early on was that when we committed to taking this production very seriously, that there was going to be a lot of setup per shot. For example, in the opening scene, when we open on Vera in Prima, we very deliberately set up one of the first shots we see of Vera. So all of that work just went into that one simple shot. Another big example of that is in the Night Op sequence, where in the background of the shot where they're making their escape, you could see a little village off in the distance. And that whole village had to be built just for that scene because we wanted to make it look like it was nearby to a place that probably called these soldiers in. And that is one of the reasons why I would really encourage people to check out the world and download it and see it for yourselves, because there's a lot of detail that the build team put into the world that we just were not able to show in the series itself.
So when they were in survival, when they did need to get hit, and they needed to get hit a lot, what we would do, there was this inside joke that came from this where the actors would start calling for, I need abs, because I would give them absorption. The absorption effect basically gives you temporary health, so you can get hit a lot more than you could normally get hit. And giving them absorption, I would just have to type in the first 3 letters, ABS. And I would just call it, who needs abs? Just call it just a quick set call. Who needs abs? I need abs, give them abs.
Yeah, and then at the end of episode 1, his arrival scene was very interesting because that was our first time working extensively with weather effects. So Lauren essentially had a little room below the ground that was full of command block jargon that's way beyond my comprehension. We essentially set it up so that a bunch of lightning would strike in the precise location that we needed it to, and then we would have one lightning bolt strike exactly where Scourge is about to land.
Rolling. All right, so go ahead and start the lightning whenever you're ready.
Another problem that we had in that scene was that it turns out the shader that we used for nighttime doesn't look good with nighttime and weather. So we used the shader that we usually use during the day for that scene. But the problem is that the reason we didn't use that shader for night is because it is extremely dark at night. So we ended up having to basically do production lighting. And in instances like that, we had a little bit of a distant artificial light so that he could be somewhat lit but still not looking unnatural, because in shaders all of the artificial lights had this sort of yellow hue that didn't always look right.
3, 2, 1, go. All right, that was excellent.
So first of all, the gate in Centaurus, before we even see the gate, there's this little effect that I like to think about every now and then, where as the gates are opening, more light is shining on our face. How do you do that in Minecraft? So we needed to figure out how to slowly light her face for that scene. What we ended up doing was having a trench that we just spawned a block of lava on the other side, and the lava would slowly flow towards her and light her face in like a really nice, natural kind of way that you would assume you would get from a door opening. What I did for those was I used a giant convoluted piston mechanism ran by a ton of command blocks underneath each gate that would spawn a bunch of pistons at the top and push a glass block down, delete the bottom row, do it again, over and over again until the door was open. So I would go into the textures, have a texture pack just for production with the glass block texture erased. So when you look at it through the texture pack, the glass blocks would just be invisible, and it would just look like the doors were being pushed down and down and down and down until it was open.
Even that came with a little bit more work though, because at this point we still weren't using Blockbuster. So the scenes had to be very deliberately shot in order to service the amount of players we had to be body actors in the scene. That's why you see it cutting back and forth, and then in the shots where they're together are essentially composited. And then what was a bigger challenge was handling the big establishing shot that comes afterwards, because that also had to be composited. So we had one shot of the gate opening and Gamma Team going through, and then another shot where we follow the same camera path with just the guard standing on top. And that took a good amount of work for me to rotoscope. That was one of the rotoscope jobs that I did handle, and I essentially had to go in frame by frame and rotoscope the guards into this shot and make it all come together.
Welcome home, soldiers.
There's no place like it.
Episode 2 is kind of one of the more peaceful episodes. This is essentially the episode that we take to just calm down and get to see the everyday life of these characters and get to know them a little bit before we throw them into the fire. Again, there was a lot of lessons to be learned about mob wrangling in the scene where Vera and Vic are fighting the monsters in their village. So there was the creeper that just refused to cooperate with us.
There's this one particular creeper from episode 2 that really pissed me off. He didn't want to do his job. He would just I would spawn him in and it's like, all right, go get Vic. He would just look around, looking dumb. It's like, all right, next, kill that guy, get a new creeper in. It's like, all right, spawn him in. It's like, all right, go get Vic. You just go the opposite direction. What the heck are you doing, creeper?
I don't know where the creeper is.
Hilarious.
There you
Yeah, that creeper does not want to come out from that corner. He's a shy creeper.
Going the opposite way.
Oh, creeper is so stupid.
Oh, I don't know where the creeper's going.
Oh, he must not have seen me still.
No, he went up the hill and then came down.
So what we did was we had a piston contraption. I think it was a double piston extender at his feet. That whenever he would spawn, it would push him out from the corner, so he can have line of sight to the victim. Just like we had to physically push him into the scene to get him to do what we wanted him to do.
The pains we go through to make creepers behave.
Because we could not get him to aggro on the player. So in episode 2, we have this little sequence that I like to call the Night on the Town sequence. That's the series of scenes where Gamma Team is having their shore leave and they're just going out partying.
So the club is interesting because we developed this bit of tech where we would have villagers reskinned as populace. If you look at the people in the club scene, their arms are real nubbly because those are the villagers. The villagers' skins, they don't have full arms. And in order to do that, I had to have a repeating command below the dance floor that would teleport all villagers one jump height up in the air and then drop them. So when we need to film a certain scene, if it's destructive or if it changes the environment somehow, we obviously would have to make a duplicate of that world, blow something up in one world, and then if we need to reset, get rid of that world, and then duplicate the clean one again until we got the scene right. And so that would leave us with several versions of the world. And sometimes in one of those versions, that repeating loop would be turned on. So we wouldn't know. All of a sudden we would try to get a villager to start doing something, and he would just start jumping. I gotta go turn this thing off in Centaurus all the way over there before we can get the scene going. I had this habit of every time we started a new world, I would go to all the spots that I knew were problematic and make sure all the settings were correct. So funny thing about the club DJ, you only see the top half of him, but that DJ, he's way too comfortable being a club DJ.
Hey.
Look at those undies.
And then after, the bar scene was an interesting challenge to shoot because it's a very simple dialogue scene, but at the same time there's so much technical complexity that went into it, namely with the stools. So that was one of the first scenes where we really had to get used to the way that we were handling seating. And there wasn't a whole lot of space in that bar, so it took a lot of careful wiring around our environment to be able to get all of the proper command equipment in there and make it repeatable shot after shot when we needed to reset.
So getting characters to sit down was tough. I found a mod that pretty much summoned in chairs that you could sit in. Looking at the mod, I figured out how they did that. They would summon in a horse that was invisible with no AI, so it would just sit there, it wouldn't move in the geometry of the chair. So you would click on the chair, you would sit in it, and it would look like you're sitting in the chair, but you're actually sitting on an invisible horse. So I stole that technology, and for every scene that we have people sitting, like the counselors or in the bar scene, I would have an invisible horse summoned in those seats in places that you could sit. The problem is, at one point, one of the updates broke how removing AI from horses works. So what it used to do is it would remove the AI from the horse, and also it would remove all of its gravity tags. If you bumped it, it wouldn't move. But at one point there was a problem with how the horses functioned while they were invisible, because you could bump them and you could move them. So we had to really delicately have these strict guidelines to how you approached and sat in chairs.
To boot, there was a lot of action in that scene that's very normal action in real life, but very challenging to portray in a Minecraft world. We had to portray this sort of bar confrontation in a way that the audience can understand what it's supposed to be, but at the same time still maintaining the fact that this is a Minecraft world, which was a very important fact for us. See, there's a bunch of little tricks we also used. For example, Eric is supposed to be this big tough guy, but the problem is all Minecraft characters are the exact same height. So one of the things we did was we propped Eric up on a little half slab, so he was about a half slab higher than everybody else when we do the shot where he's looking down at the cop and the cop's looking up at him. And that allowed us to do some camera techniques, doing some low angles and high angles that you are used to seeing in film, but in a Minecraft setting.
So that bar was fun. Every single drink in the bar is named, and every single name is a reference to something specific. For example, the potion of regeneration is named the Logan.
Scourge's Ascension was a very interesting scene to shoot. That was one of those scenes that we had to do a lot with a little. There's a lot of little workarounds we had to do to be able to make some of that stuff happen. For example, it was in that moment that we encountered one of the problems that we would go on to encounter quite a bit, which was the fact that sometimes player models would disappear when they cross a chunk threshold of some sort.
When you're going through there, you disappear.
I'm confused.
Am I gone?
Yeah, you're gone. Yep, you guys are all disappearing a little bit.
And eventually we would find out that the way to get around that is to have the camera be moving, even if just a little bit. But we didn't know that at the time, and so that was a little bit of a problem. But eventually we got the shots we needed. Interesting fact about Scourge is that his skin actually has multiple layers. That was all done in machinima. Like there wasn't any editing involved in that. That was just the body actor turning on the various articles of clothing on the skin. So that was a very neat practical way to do that.
Action. You got double lightning behind you. Go. Ooh, that one had a lightning up at the end.
Alright, so in episode 3 was essentially the first big episode that kickstarts the main story into action. And we wanted to be very explosive with this episode. Essentially, the purpose of the first 3 episodes were to introduce you to these characters and create a consistency and normal pace to their lives that you could get used to, and then interrupt that very suddenly so that the audience, along with these characters, can both say, okay, something's different, this is wrong. And the way we did that was essentially by having Scourge give them a challenge that they couldn't overcome in the form of a lot of mobs. And what's interesting about Scourge was we wanted to have this very deliberate pacing to his evolution. So he starts out as basically this guy that just creates a whole lot of mobs and then lets them loose. And as we go on, his attacks become more calculated, and he starts to do more elaborate schemes and setups. But when we first start out, we wanted to very deliberately exclude Scourge from all of the action and essentially just have a sudden increase in mobs that can't be explained by any of the characters. And we really want to get that big, epic feel across where all of the sudden there's a lot more hostiles than they're ready to take on. And in order to do that, we essentially had to have a lot of mobs on screen on the same time. So what Lauren did was set up some commands that would essentially allow us to flood an area with many mobs at one time using a lever, and basically every single moment that the lever was on, more mobs would spawn.
What, are we spawning the entire population of Costa Rica in here?
And then we would essentially just turn on their AI, the body actors go into survival mode, and just watch all of these creatures converge. And it ended up for some pretty interesting and epic effects that kind of got the feel across.
Alright, go.
Chicken!
Oh god.
Alright, that's a cut.
Help me! This is horrible.
One of the crazy things about the sequence where Gamma Team gets attacked, we wanted to have like a sort of walk and talk type of shot where we track the horses while their dialogue is happening. But the problem is, it was very difficult to do that on the terrain that we were shooting on because it had all sorts of ups and downs, and we tried it and it didn't quite work very well. So instead, what we did was we created an entirely separate world, a set world as we like to call it, because we ended up using that world for a whole lot of different set pieces that are not in the main world, where we placed this little artificial forest in the middle of it, and then created a clear path in the middle of that forest that all of our cast members could get on horses and run through. that was very interesting, and we ended up getting a lot of mileage out of that because we had to do a couple of shots like that throughout the series. And all that for those couple of shots that we have where they're running back and retreating. And then even after that, getting the creeper explosion that kills their horses was also a challenge. Because first of all, the explosion had to be huge. Second of all, it couldn't damage the environment. And third of all, it had to kill a lot of mobs and all of their horses without harming the players.
The zombies have evolved. Or, I mean, they have a hive mind at least.
That does look a bit like a PM.
What this looks like.
Oh!
They didn't die.
Yeah, they moved a bit, but they didn't die.
So it was an elaborate set of conditions that needed to be met, and Lauren, through all sorts of command block coding, managed to make that happen. But it was still, it still took a great many takes to get the timing exactly right. It definitely tried the patience of our cast members a little bit. So one of the things that we wanted to take very seriously was character deaths. Was to establish these important supporting characters within the first act and make the audience really care for them and connect with them and almost feel like you're going to spend the rest of the series with them, only to have them die and never come back. So Vic was one of those characters. My goal with Cap was to essentially make it come off like he's going to be, you know, as the leader of this team, one of the hero figures. In the end, he ends up, I guess, kind of fulfilling that role and making a noble sacrifice that allows Nim and Eric to kind of step up and become the more important characters that they go on to be. So yeah, then of course there's the final set piece of episode 3, which is the massive Prima battle, as we like to call it, and that was an extreme challenge, but that was also a huge exercise in mob wrangling. Even just getting the shot where the zombies start pouring in from the corner of the village took a great many tries to get the exact effect that we wanted. And then yeah, there are a couple of big long takes in this scene that we wanted to kind of include to just get this very interesting ebb and flow to the action.
So at the end of episode 3, there's a little village man in the watchtower. We couldn't actually get him being shot by a skeleton because there was just too much going on. So what we ended up doing was we had one separate shot of a skeleton trapped by some barrier blocks in down below where he was supposed to be. And we would just have, I think it was one of us just standing up where he was supposed to look and just going into survival mode, so he would look up at us and shoot his bow at us. First of all, we had to set up a bunch of tracks for these zombies to come in through the village from, so that these zombies would look like they were spread out pretty evenly. And then we had, on the other end, I would have to walk forward, input a command that would have a dispenser shoot an arrow and kill me, and have all of my innards explode everywhere, and I pretty much had to stock my inventory full of stuff that didn't stack. That way it looked like there's a lot of stuff that the villager dropped.
But yeah, and that's another example of one of those very deliberate shots where there is so much effort that goes into making that shot function, from the action that's going on in the background to the action that's going on in the foreground, that most people won't even think about because the shots only last a couple of seconds long.
So in the shot when it would go down below the ground and it would show this machinery that would place all the TNT blocks in the area. For that shot, that was really fun because we basically just went into a whole new world, like just a blank, empty, void world, and we just made this little box. I would just mess around in there and just try to figure out different mechanisms that didn't really do anything. They just moved pistons and blocks up and down and left and right, just to make it look complicated and busy, and a lot of just, as what Raph would call technical jargon. I would just just make a little circuit, and then I would repeat it pretty far and have a lot of stuff in the foreground, a lot of stuff in the background.
The long take that we do where Vic fights his way to the armory, that took a good many takes, but it was essentially just running the same camera path over and over again. There were a few takes that I think ended because Vic ended up dying prematurely.
Keep running. Oh, you're in camera view. Oh, you got held up a little bit, but keep running. Oh, you're so close. Get to the armory. Oh, you barely got stopped at the armory.
The big dolly shot where we kind of pull out, starting from the ground level of the village and then going all the way up into the sky, was definitely one of the toughest things within that sequence. Mainly, I guess, on a post-production perspective, because that shot was actually comprised of several shots. I think there was at least 4, maybe 5 shots, I can't recall, involved in that composite. Because we start with just a clean plate of doing the shot with the TNT charges set in place and no zombies on the field anywhere, then we did a couple of different shots with NPC villagers placed at various points throughout the village, and then spawning select groups of zombies to close in on them, and it basically gave it this look of getting slowly, gradually swarmed by these zombies. And then once we had all those shots, we just composited them all together to get the final product that you see in that big long take. The interesting thing about that explosion was there was actually two different explosions. There was, first of all, the explosion was just for the camera. It wasn't a practical explosion. In fact, the explosion that you see from the top-down shot isn't even touching the village. It's closer to the camera than it is to the village. It's just sort of this cloud of particle effects floating above it. And then for the shots where we follow Vera leaving the village, that's an entirely different perspective, and we had an entirely different set of explosions to make it look like a big explosion from that perspective, because if we used the same one, it wouldn't work from those angles.